This topic has come up a lot in the vinyl community over the last couple of weeks since Sea of Tranquility did it, and Melinda Murphy's done it, Mazzy's done it. And I figured it would be a perfect way to kick off a new season of this show because I haven't done one of these for months. And I have a whole list of stuff from last season I have to do yet. But we'll be covering that topic on this episode. 10 albums that changed my life. I'm TC Kirkham, TKR Video Central. Welcome to Influencers. Hey everybody, TC Kirkham, the Kirkham Report, TKR Video Central. Thank you for joining me for this season premiere of Influencers. 10 albums that changed my life. Now, I got to tell you, there's a lot more than 10 that have done that, so there'll probably be 2 and 3 down the road. And because I'm still working on my office reset, there are things in front of my albums, and I could not get to 2 of the albums I wanted to include on this list. So they'll be on a future one. I picked out a couple of other ones that were definitely qualify. But I picked 10 that I had profound feelings about when they came out and what it did to me. I'm a pop guy. I'm the OG pop master in the vinyl community. So a lot of these are pop, but you might be surprised to see some of these on here. I'm going to do them in chronological order, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about why I picked it. And hopefully, I won't bore you to death. Starting with this one, I'm actually so happy to see a reissue of this coming out at Record Store Day. My copy I've had since I was 3 years old, so almost 54 years, and it's not in the best shape. It's not in terrible shape, it's still playable, but a lot of clicks and pops. And it means a lot to me because when I was 3, I was just getting into music. My mom was a big music fan. I've talked about her on other episodes, and she was getting me into music, and I was listening to more and more rock and roll with the kids in the little town of Waverly where I lived at the time. And she was more into, easy listening, lounge and stuff, and I love that too because of her. But I had a crush on this lady, a big one, and I was 3. And she couldn't get me the original, the one with the big hit, so she got me the next album when it came out. I think it was a present for my 4th birthday, if I'm not mistaken. I really love it, and I still love it, and I love her to this day. This is the mono edition of How Does That Grab You by Nancy Sinatra. Terrible shape. I wrote on it. There was gum stuck on it at one time. I underlined and crisscrossed on the song tracks. But Nancy Sinatra was the first musician I ever really gravitated to. Loved her when she would be on performing Boots Is Made for Walking, which is the one that I don't have on album. I don't think I have. I might have a copy now, but I didn't have it then. And I listened to this album constantly when I was a kid. My favorite song, other than the title track, I love Bang Bang, which is a duet with Lee Hazelwood. Fantastic, fantastic stuff. And her version of Call Me and Let It Be Me, both great stuff. Crying Time, classic country song. The one song on here I'm not happy about because I don't like the song itself is The Shadow of Your Smile. I've never liked that song. I don't know why. I just don't care for it. I don't care for any version of it, instrumental, vocal, whatever. So I usually skipped over that track. But I got a lot of hours listening to this on my little blue GE Kitty record player when I was a kid. and a lot more when I actually got access to the stereo when I was 6 or 7. From 1967, I believe this came out. Might be 66. Nancy Sinatra and How Does That Grab You? Number 2, this album is not the first album by this duo, but I love the first 2 albums too, don't get me wrong. But this album had all the big songs on it that I loved. All my favorite songs. And it is, to this day, one of my favorite albums by them. It's not my very favorite. That was 1975's Horizon. But this album is right up there. And at the time it came out, they were regulars on a summer series called Make Your Own Kind of Music. And I wanted to be Richard Carpenter, and I wanted to have somebody, a sister that sang like Karen. This is Carpenters from 1971, known as the Tan album to most fans. This is the album with Rainy Days and Mondays, Superstar, the Bacharach David medley, which is great. For All We Know is included here. The non-single Let Me Be the One, which was finally released as a single off of the box set From the Top in 1989. And a few other tracks. Richard's song on this album is Drusilla Penny. And Saturday also, which was the flip side of Rainy Days and Mondays. But One Love, I love One Love. I remember when Karen sang One Love on Make Your Own Kind of Music. I remember watching her standing there just not budging, listening to this song. It is still one of my favorite songs by them. It's an album track which was written by Richard and John Bettis. I remember when I was younger and there were no car seat laws for kids. My mom and stepfather, we had this gigantic Mercury Park Lane. I had the back seat to myself. I used to call the seat, the armrest, my bucket seat. I would sit on that so I could see out. And at night, sometimes when we were driving back from my grandma's house or somewhere else, I was small enough that I could climb up onto the back, under the window, and put my head against the speaker. And I remember hearing Superstar that way a number of times. You guys know how I feel about Karen Carpenter. She was the true goddess of all time, musically, and I miss her very much. I wish my petition to get them in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame would work better. I'm still going to try. I'm going to keep trying until we get them in there. 1971's Carpenters. The next album will surprise people. It's not something that most people would put on their, wow, really influential albums. But before this album came out, I was not really the kind of person that would take the time to understand the lyrics of the songs. I would know them, I would sing along with them, but this man made me listen to his lyrics, made me figure out what he was talking about in this song. He is one of, if not the greatest single songwriter of all time, in my book. His music, his lyrics, depending on who he was working with, always fantastic. And for a period of time, he had a string of hits in the late 50s and early 60s, and then disappeared for 10 years or better. And then came roaring back in late 1974 with this beautiful love ballad and an album filled with incredible songs. It today is still one of my favorite albums of that period, and I listen to it. I have the digital copy. I listen to it all the time. I just think this man is a genius, and I always will. From 1974, Sedaka's Back by Neil Sedaka. This is a compilation of 3 of his British albums from the early 1970s, released on Elton John's Rocket Records label. It includes some of Neil's classic songs. Standing on the Inside, that's where the music takes me. Laughter in the Rain, that ballad I was talking about. Sad Eyes, Solitaire, Little Brother, Love Will Keep Us Together, which would be a hit for the Captain Tennille a few months later. The Immigrant, The Way I Am, The Other Side of Me, A Little Lovin', and our last song together, the final song he wrote at the time with Howie Greenfield, who is his main lyricist. Neil Sedaka made me think about lyrics. And the song that really stood out that way was The Immigrant. The Immigrant was a song he wrote about John Lennon's legal troubles with the U.S., trying to remain in the U.S. in the mid-70s. I love that song to this day. I think it is relevant today. And this song, Solitaire, which I love by everybody I've ever heard it by. Karen Carpenter's version is stupendous. Clay Aiken knocked it out of the ballpark. There's other versions. Neil's versions, of course, was a hit in Europe. Andy Williams also had a beautiful version. Laughter in the Rain. What? It's a perfect love song. I have not got as many albums by Neil as I'd like to have, but I did pick up his entire Electric collection when he released it last year. The man is still active in his mid-80s. He's still doing concerts on YouTube. He's still doing touring, or will get back to touring now that COVID is over. I find him amazing and a genius, and he is. 1974's Sedaka's Back. 1975, I was 12 in March. I'm going to get a drink here. And although I knew this band from before, and I was familiar with their hits, this is the album that truly turned me into a rabid fan, which I have remained to this day. Two of them are no longer with us. This album brought them back from the brink a second time. Now, in the late 60s, turmoil within the band caused a breakup that lasted for 18 months. And then when they got back together, they had two of the biggest hits of their career, and then they went into another slump for another 2 or 3 years. This album not only broke the slump, within 2 years of this album, they would become the biggest rock act on the planet. And it's because this is the first album that they did this style of music on. A drastic change from the 60s and early 70s. And it turned them into true superstars. From 1975, Main Course by Bee Gees. This is the album with Jive Talkin', Nights on Broadway, and Fanny Be Tender With My Love. Their three biggest hits in several years. Come On Over was later a hit for Olivia Newton-John. I'm partial to Wind of Change because Wind of Change was the song that KFI Radio played on their nightly album giveaway. Now, KFI was a KVI Seattle. KFI is Los Angeles. KVI Seattle. I liked it, and I knew they wouldn't give it to me because you had to leave a comment on a voicemail, and they picked what they felt was the best comment. I told my mother exactly what to say, and she won the album. This is the KVI promotional copy. See that sticker there? This is so far removed from Massachusetts. I started a joke. New York mining disaster. Even Run to Me and How Can You Mend a Broken Heart and Lonely Days, which I played last week on Obscuria. And within 2 years, 2 more albums would go by. 1 studio, 1 live, and then Saturday Night Fever hit, and there was no looking back. The Bee Gees are just one of my favorite acts of all time, and this album is why. main chorus by Bee Gees, 1975. Now, people can poo-poo me all they want to on this. They have. But I love the act that's behind this next entry on my list of 10 albums that changed my life. I had never heard music like this before. I mean, it's standard folk pop. But, and, you know, it leans toward dance pop on a couple later albums when they moved further into the 70s. But what I loved about these four people from the very beginning was the intricate four-part harmonies they did. ABBA is good. All the doo-wop guys are good in the 50s. Don't get me wrong. I love them too. These guys have such a terrible reputation because, not because they don't deserve recognition, which they do, but because they beat Boston for Best New Artist at the 1977 Grammy Awards. And then never had another hit. Not another big hit, at least. And I'm sorry. You can badmouth them all you want to. They remain one of my all-time favorite acts, and their debut album is damn near perfect. 1976's Starland Vocal Band. On the back, John Carroll, Margot Kidder. No, not Margot Kidder. That's terrible because her name is totally slipped away from me right now. Margot Chapman, thank you. John Carroll, Margot Chapman, Bill Danoff, Taffy Danoff. Bill and Taffy had been together for years, first as Fat City and then as Bill and Taffy. A lot of the stuff that they did on their four albums under those two names would eventually make up some of the Starland Vocal Band repertoire. John Carroll remained a popular singer in the Washington, D.C. area throughout the 80s. I just picked up a couple of his later solo albums that were fantastic about a year ago, and they're awesome. Afternoon Delight is listed as a guilty pleasure by many people. And truthfully, when you listen to the lyrics, it's one of the filthiest songs to ever hit #1 on AM radio. But their version of Paul Simon's American Tune on this album is completely a cappella, and it will send chills down your spine. John Carroll's lead vocal on Starland is amazing. He was 19 when they recorded this album. This is phenomenal, and they deserve better than they get. I will always tout how wonderful I think they are, because they truly became one of my favorite acts of all time. Starland Vocal Band, 1976. I've talked a lot about this album and this gentleman. He's one of my favorite artists. And if you've seen my other shows, and if you've seen Vinyl Recall, you heard me talk about it there. You heard me talk about it on Robert Z's Lottery this year. You have to get very particular for me to find a pop album perfect. There is one album on the planet that I consider perfect, and two more that I consider near perfect. Almost as good as this one. This album remains my all-time favorite album, and my biggest regret is I never got a chance to see him perform live. He is amazing, and after this album, I have tried to get almost everything. I'm missing a couple things, but again, thanks to Neil Sedaka earlier, the lyrics. He is an amazing storyteller, and this album was amazingly put together, and it is my all-time favorite album, 1978's City to City by Jerry Rafferty. Baker Street is my all-time favorite song. I could listen to it 24/7, 365 and never get sick of it. I adore Whatever's Written in Your Heart, one of the most beautiful heartbreak ballads I've ever heard. It's 6 minutes long, and it is phenomenal. The rest of this album is equally as good. This is a technically perfect pop album. Now, he is on the fringes of rock, AC, even R&B in places. And it depends on what, and Celtic, it's even a Celtic sounding, even though he was Scottish, to some of this, to some of his output. This album, which includes the hits Baker Street, Right Down the Line, and Home and Dry, as well as all the terrific album tracks, if Hanson's Underneath, which is the closest thing to a technically perfect pop album I've ever heard since this, couldn't knock it out of number one, not much is probably going to do so. I love this album. I have a newer orange vinyl reissue from a couple years ago. This is the OG from 1978, Jerry Rafferty and City to City. As I got older, when I was in Harrington, Washington, where I grew up my teen years, I was into disco. I was into teen idols. I was into pop music and beautiful music. I wasn't really into the heavy metal that so many of my friends were into. They were into Kiss and Ted Nugent and Nazareth, Aerosmith. I got into all of them later, but not at that time. But in now see, this is where this whole 10 albums that changed your life has to take a deviant, because I'm going to talk about an album, but a single is what first got me starting to shift a bit. I had a wonderful lady who was a beautician in town. She was a young lady named Kenna Kay Elledge. I know she's out there. Hi, Kenna Kay, if you hear this. Who introduced me to album rock radio and introduced me to some of the new wave acts that were coming along when I was a sophomore and junior in high school. One of those acts was the Police, and in particular their first single in America, Roxanne. I love that song to this day. I would spend hours at Kenna Kay's house listening to music with her and talking about the songs. And it slowly tilted me toward the new sound that was emerging from Europe called New Wave. There was some in America, but not as much. By 1980, New Wave was starting to really connect. And from 1979 forward, New Wave made inroads as itself with bands like The Cars, Gary Newman, and it also started pushing into the dance realm with acts like Robin Scott, more commonly known as M of pop music fame. But this duo, I was electrified by their music from the second I heard it. I heard the single when it debuted on American Top 40 in December of 1979. It peaked at number 30, which is really hilarious considering what a classic it is now. And a month or so later, I heard Creme FM, the album rock station, played a whole album in its entirety every night at midnight. And one Friday night, they played this album. And I was like, Mom, I got to get this album. It is awesome. I love this album. To this day. They have another album that was out also that was just as good, but it didn't get seen much because they were breaking up by that point. But there is no more classic new wave for me than this album. And it's another one that changed the way I looked at music. I had never really thought of electronic music before, not really in a sense that it would take over my life musically for a while here and there over the course of the next 40 years. This was the album that started it all, and the single was what launched it in a big way. From 1979, The Age of Plastic by the Buggles. Trevor Horn, Jeff Downes. Video Killed the Radio Star, launched MTV. Now we have to do Streaming Killed the Video Star. 8 songs, incredible stories. My favorite song by them is Kid Dynamo, which is on side one. Um, but this whole album, oh my God, I have listened to this album so many times in my lifetime because it is an amazing piece of music. Um, the second album, Adventures in Modern Recording, is also good. Jeff had already left for Asia at that point, and Trevor was working with Yes and would later produce Frankie Goes to Hollywood and a few other acts. But they will never top this for me, The Age of Plastic by the Buggles. I pulled this album because I don't know if I have the first album on vinyl or CD. I have it on CD. I don't know if I have it on vinyl. I couldn't find it. So I think Kim has it on vinyl. And I can't get to her albums. But that first album triggered the second album. The second album, while I liked the first album a little better, the second album put them on the market in a bigger way. And the third album would explode them nationally and internationally. And they would become the true superstars they are now. But there is something about the chemistry that these five people had on these first two albums, not to take away from the later contributions of a couple other people, but the original five had a chemistry that wouldn't quit, or so we thought. That chemistry would change on the third album when Pete Wills was booted and Phil Collin came in, but this is the album that cemented my opinion about Def Leppard being one of the greatest rock bands of all time. High and Dry from 1981. I love On Through the Night. I like it even better than this one. But I couldn't find it. So I don't think I have it on vinyl, and I wanted to keep this stuck on vinyl. This, of course, has the original version of Bringing On the Heartbreak, and it was MTV that broke them nationally when Pyromania came out in 1983. And they're still releasing stuff and still doing tours and still doing fantastic music. And they just had another hit on the Kirkham Report Power Tracks 50 with Goodbye for Good this time from the Drastic Symphonies album. I've got every album these guys have ever done. I love them. I have seen them in concert twice. They are phenomenal in concert. There's just something about this original combination, which was Joe Elliott, Rick Allen, Rick Savage, and on this album, Pete Wills and the late Steve Clark, who were just amazing together. Now, I'm not going to lie. I've said a number of times Adrenalize is my favorite album by them from 1992, but that was Vivian Campbell's first album with them, technically. I don't think he actually started recording with them at that point, but he was on the tour with them. And Phil Collin replaced Pete Willis earlier, and Vivian was Steve Clark's replacement when he passed away. These guys are still rocking 50 years, almost 50 years later. And I mean, they are the Stones of their generation. They're still going strong, still looking good. They're still only in their 60s. They're not like in their 80s like Jagger and company. And I never get tired of their music. And this album is one of the reasons why Def Leppard's High and Dry. Check another drink here. I've always been a fan of instrumental music because of my mom. My mom was big into Boots Randolph and Pete Fountain when I was a kid, and Esquivel, and a number of other acts. So I always gravitated. I love beautiful music. I love lounge music. I love Muzak. And if you haven't checked out Stuffer White's stuff on YouTube, go check it out. Sound of Muzak. He puts together some great stuff. In 1984, this was my first introduction to this gentleman. And I was mesmerized. I have first 4 albums on vinyl and all 7 of the first 7 albums on CD. And I hear him mentioned in the vinyl community, and most people don't really know who he is. Chris Prophy is one of the few people I've heard that I know is a fan. But the minute I heard his music, they interviewed him on Entertainment Tonight when his second album came out. I heard the second album. We had a promo of it at Buzzard's Nest Records where I was working at the time, and I liked it. It's a good album. But I bought it, and I bought the first album. And the first album was freaking amazing. It is still my favorite album by the man, although Down to the Moon comes a close second. And if you don't know who he is, maybe you should find him, because it's an amazing experience. This is Andreas Vollenweider. Behind the Gardens, Behind the Wall, Under the Tree. This is his debut album for CBS Masterworks, 1984. He plays the electroacoustic harp, and he is the person that introduced me into New Age music. New Age, at the time, in the mid-'80s, was the new beautiful music. And as a result of becoming such a rabid fan of Vollenweider's, I missed him the one time he's been to Boston that I remember. I didn't get to go see him. He led me to David Lanz, Michael Gettle, Friedman, Craig Chicasso, and a number, Yanni even, a number of other acts, John Tesh, that I became monstrous fans of. New Age is not all, like George Winston. George Winston's piano music is beautiful, and it's perfect for some people. I like it, but some people think it's boring. This is not boring, people. Put this on. Close your eyes. Better yet, if you got an eye mask for bedtime, put it on, lay down on the bed, and let it wash over you. You will have no idea what you are missing. Andreas Vollenweider, Behind the Gardens, Behind the Wall, Under the Tree. Finally, there were two albums, like I said, that I couldn't pull because I couldn't get to them. And this is one of the albums I substituted because it would be on the next list anyway. I started getting more into heavier metal and heavier music in the mid-'80s when MTV started playing all the hair metal. Rat, Guns N' Roses, Poison, Motley Crue, Def Leppard, all these other acts. And one of the acts I got into was this gentleman. Our local radio station played this album to death, a couple particular songs off of it. And I never had the vinyl until 2 years ago. I had the CD. I got the vinyl from my Black Box Record Club thing, and I was ecstatic because it is so pristine on vinyl. It's made by Music on Vinyl, so you know it's going to be good. This album was the first big one to click for him, and I have always gravitated in my life. Because of my mother, I gravitated towards saxophone. My mom was a big Boots Randolph fan. I love sax solos. That's why Baker Street is my favorite song of all time. That's why, until Foolish Beat came along, I couldn't stand Debbie Gibson. I love Foolish Beat. And it's that sax riff. And I've gravitated toward keyboards. I love keyboards, and that was Richard Carpenter's influence. I love keyboards. Regular keyboards, electric keyboards, synthesizers. I don't care. Right now I'm listening to a lot of Michael Christensen, one of the Vinyl Community members, who does a lot of stuff with keyboards and guitar and stuff that I love. And Michael Gettle? No. That's terrible. Let me look it up real quick. Michael Whalen. There it is. Who is an amazing instrumental film guy who does pop music on the side and new age music on the side. Love his stuff. This is the guy that got me into rock guitar. And at this point, I wasn't really I'm still not an overwhelming heavy metal fan, except for Def Leppard and harder edged hair bands, But this guy I have every album the guy has done, I think. I have bought them all on digital a few years ago. I have loved this album since it came out. If you haven't heard the new album, which it doesn't get very much airplay, but it is fabulous. Um, this man became a true guitar god to me, and he is that to millions of people. And this album is why. Surfing with the Alien, Joe Satriani. I have talked about my love for Satriani, and I'm going to be doing a whole influencers on him one of these days. This album is so good. I mean, the title track alone is fantastic. But everything on this album, every song on this album, just gets me in such a mood. And it was my first real intro to his music. Now later on, I didn't pick up everything else. I bought this when it came out in 87, I think it was. Originally released 1987 on CD. But I didn't get anything else until Engines of Creation in 2000. And then I went back and got a whole bunch of his older stuff because I was familiar with some of the other stuff from The Extremist and other stuff from radio. And I had digital copies of it, but I went back and bought all the albums on digital. Satriani is amazing, and I love him to death, and I always will. And the new album, Pyramids of Mars, is one of his best albums, and I really don't think people are giving it enough credit. I don't see enough people talking about it. I don't understand why the vinyl community doesn't talk more about Joe Satriani. He seems to be the kind of person that'd be right up the alley of all these classic rock people I see. And yet nobody talks about him. Is he the pop guy's guitarist? I mean, because he has a pop sound that I like as well as the metal? Is that why nobody talks about him? Because he changed my perception of guitar rock, and I became a fan of a whole host of instrumental artists, including Eric Johnson and later Craig Chicasa, who I have talked about, who I adore, and a few others. And that album was the reason why. Surfing with the Alien, Joe Satriani. So, those are 10 albums that changed my life, that had a big influence on my life. I have a part 2, part 3, part 4. I would love to do them. If you want to hear them, hit me up in the comments. I don't normally do this kind of show on influencers, but I thought it would be great because of the current... I don't think Sea of Tranquility meant for it to be a thread, but everybody's doing it. I've seen Mazzy's, and I've seen Linda Murphy's, and I know Dylan at Noble Records did one, and I've seen a few of the other ones. And it's really fascinating because you find out a lot about a person when you find out what influences their lives, what kind of music influences their lives. And these 10 albums, along with the 2 I had to remove because I couldn't get to them, and a few other ones I'd love to talk about, and some of those would be on CD, not just on vinyl. If you want to hear more, I got more. If it makes you feel like you've gotten to know me a little bit better and my mindset, the way I think, by all means, say, hey, give us a part 2, give us a part 3. I'd do it. I'll do it. I don't know when, because I have a ton more people to do on influencers that were supposed to be done last season, but haven't been done yet, including Mr. Satriani. Also, coming up this season, we will be seeing... Let me pull up my list here. That's not what I wanted. We'll also be seeing the Bee Gees, Journey, Jerry Rafferty, Journey. Again, I've got it on my list twice for some reason. They're twice as good, I guess. Three Dog Night, Katie Lang, a few other people. A gentleman named Ish Ledesma. I'd love to know how many of you know who he is. And a few other people, all coming up this season on influencers. And I hope you will enjoy watching it. We should be back on every Tuesday at 4 from this point on. If you haven't subscribed already, please do. And if you have, thank you very much. I'm close to 500. I'd like to make it to 500 by my birthday on March 15th. And to 1,000 by the end of the year. We'll see what happens. I got lots more irons in the fire, lots of other shows. And you can find shows on TKR Video Central or as part of the TKR Introverse. which is the new thing I'm calling it. 7 days a week at generally at 4, at 11, 4, and 7, and it's Eastern Time, 11 a.m., 4 p.m., and 7 p.m. They include a bunch of new shows that will be premiering over the next 2 weeks here and on TKR Mixcloud, and a lot of other stuff. Thank you for following that stuff, and if you haven't done so, please share out what I do and leave a comment so I know how I'm doing. Let me know if you want to see a second part or a third part of this. I'd love to do one. And until next time, I'll see you on the interwebs. For Influencers, I'm TC Kirkham, TKR Video Central. Ciao, baby.